So welcome to week 9 of my Unhitched webinar short series. These are a series of weekly, short, easily digestible webinars designed to share with you some of the biggest questions and issues I hear in my practice. And this week we're going to be covering feeling all the feels, so emotions basically. So you are in the right place if you're feeling a little bit stuck or unhappy in your marriage and you are dealing with some uncomfortable emotions. And I'm not going to call them negative. I think some people do call certain emotions like rage and grief and sadness negative, but I see them more as messengers. So let's not kill the messenger. Let's just view them for what they are. So they may be a little uncomfortable, but they're not bad. And I think many of us, this topic is important because for many of us, we are not taught much about emotions in our family of origin or in school. So we grow up and maybe we've been told we're too sensitive, we're too much, or we are not allowed to feel certain emotions. I have a lot of clients who share that anger, for example, was not allowed in their household, or too much crying was not allowed in their household. So we get to be an adult and we don't really know what to do with them. And it's very hard to be an emotional adult when you don't have the proper training to be an emotional adult. And we are, if you're in a human body, which I'm assuming if you are watching this, you are wired to feel them, whether you are male or female or anything in between in a transition period. You are human and you are wired to feel them. So it's important that we know what to do with them. So before we dive into our content for today, if you don't know me, my name is Sunny Joy McMillan. I'm a recovering attorney, a practicing coach. I am the author of the book Unhitched, Unlock Your Courage and Clarity to Unstick Your Bad Marriage. I host the Sunny in Seattle radio show, and my work has been featured in places like the King County Collaborative Law Association, the Collaborative Professionals of Washington, OprahMagazine.com, Best Self, Hay House Radio, and some other places. But as I always like to say, even more important, I think, than any of the credentials is the fact that I myself am a divorcee, and I went through a pretty high conflict marriage, which meant I had a lot of uncomfortable emotions when I was in that situation. And I, like many of my clients and many of you out there, I didn't know what to do with them. And it took me several years, more than several, to get to the place now where I really welcome them and I know how to deal with them. Basically, I had a life that I wanted to look very perfect. And so whatever negative emotions I was feeling, I suppressed. And I also think I hear this from a lot of clients. I don't want to overgeneralize or stereotype, but especially in the South, and for some of my clients who are from the South, as was I, nice, genteel Southern ladies don't feel certain things, or if they do, they certainly don't show them, anger being one of the biggies. And so I got to a place in my marriage where I didn't even realize it at the time, and I'll share more about this in a little while, but that I was basically suppressing everything, and it was manifesting in my life, just seeping out in ways that were not so pleasant. And so if you relate to any of this and you don't really know what to do with your emotions, and they may be kind of a nuisance, or as I saw them as a weakness or something, then this is the place for you. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes today talking about how to feel all the feels, what happens when you don't, and how you can actually use them to your benefit. And so I'm not going to take any questions. Keep it nice and short as possible. And if you do want to take this further, I'll share how at the end, or you can always keep showing up to these webinars. So I think I'm going to do them through the end of the summer. So let's go over some of basics when it comes to emotions. So number one, I told you I'd share a little bit about my story. So of course, I had a high conflict marriage. I had a lot of emotions. But I didn't really know it at the time. I didn't know how to identify them. If you ever saw the movie The Devil Wears Prada, the main character played by Meryl Streep, who is based on the lady named Anna Wintour, was just very steely. And I felt like, oh, she was so composed and she had it all together and there were no weaknesses in her facade. And so that's how I wanted to be. But if you're a human, again, which I'm assuming you are wired to feel emotions. So if you're not allowing yourself to feel them, if you're putting up that facade, if you're suppressing the emotions, it's going to come out in some not so pleasant ways usually. So for me, I ended up, I was in therapy for a lot of my marriage, whether that was couples counseling or my own personal therapy, depending on when that was in the marriage. I had more of couples or less of individual, or vice versa. At this point, I was in just my own personal individual therapy. So I would come into therapy and I would sit like this with my arms crossed, with my shoulders up around my ears and all tense. And at one point, my therapist looked at me and said, "Sunny, uncross your arms and legs." And I did. And she was like, "What's happening in your chest area, like right around where your heart is?" I was like, "What is she talking about?" She goes, "No, just humor me. I want you to just bring your awareness to that area. And I want you to breathe a little bit and tell me what you feel." I was like, "Oh my gosh, it feels like there is a cinder block, or like there's an elephant sitting on my chest." She was like, "Yeah, that is what you've been holding inside." So she advised me to just breathe and allow and relax my body. And I began to cry. And what I have learned since that time through, not only coach training, but some of my own research on emotions and similar topics like neuroplasticity and positive psychology. And so what I learned along the way was that we as humans suppress emotions through shallow breathing, like breathing from, like half your chest up, and muscular contraction. And so basically what I had been doing was just holding everything in and hoping that it didn't come out. And of course, there are times when you just can't hold it in. And I would have fits of rage at times. It seems very out of character with who I know myself to be now. But when you let a dam build up to that level, when it seeps out, it's not going to be pretty. So I went through several years, especially as I was doing coach training, when they were having us notice and name our emotions and check in on how we're feeling. And that's what we are being taught to do. I would have these crying jags when I would let myself just relax and breathe. And it was just, there was a lot of stuff that needed to come up and out. And there are a lot of other modalities that you can use rather than just, breathing is simple and it's free and it's an easy way to do it. There are other modalities that can really help bring up and out trauma or things that are stored in the body. But, for your basic allowance of suppressed emotions, breathing can be really nice. So I may be talking about this and you may be thinking, "Oh God, I don't want that. Why would you want to encourage all that to come up and out?" Well, there's some good reasons, and I don't want you to be scared by it. Number one, as I mentioned, we are wired for emotions. It is just basically a chemical response in the body that gets triggered, and it runs in the body. And it's supposed to, and ideally, just like a waterfall, move through you. And so the chemical reaction can move through you. You can feel the emotion and it will dissipate. And unimpeded by thoughts, that's what will happen. So if you have been suppressing them, though, it can be a little bit more of an exercise to invite it to come up and out. So we'll talk more about that. But also know that you're human. And so there's this spectrum of emotions. And you've got, like, at the extreme end on one side, joy and love. And then at the extreme end on the other side, you've got, I think at the very lowest when they calibrate emotions, apathy, I think, is the very last one on the scale, because there's not even any oomph in it left anymore. And so anywhere in between, you've got, happiness or peace or frustration or rage. And so you've got this spectrum. So chances are you're going to be feeling something uncomfortable about 50% of the time. That's okay. It's not a big deal. You can handle it, I promise. And the way that this normally goes down, and it's a very simple trigger of events, like a little domino effect. There's a circumstance that happens. Based on that circumstance, you're going to have a thought about it. You're going to make it mean something. Your mind's going to get involved. Then based on the thought you have, that will trigger an emotion. And based on that emotion, you may take some action or no action, and then you will have a result. So I'll just give you a very simple example. This is an example from my own life based on my marriage and then my current relationship with my partner. So my ex-husband was very, very messy. And that, because I'm a little bit OCD about cleanliness, would make me so angry. And so anytime, let's say I'd see, and for you, this can be the example, your spouse leaves their socks on the floor. And so you look at those socks, there's the circumstance, there are socks on the floor, and you have a thought. So the thought that I had when I was married was, he is so lazy and he never contributes around the house. So that's a thought. when I am believing that thought or thinking that thought, what does it make me feel? It made me feel angry and resentful. And when I felt angry and resentful, what did I do? I'd go in the other room and be incredibly passive aggressive. I might actually be overtly aggressive and really reprimand him and say, why? Why can't you clean up after yourself? And then when you take that kind of action, what's the result you get? A marriage filled with resentment and disconnection and just growing mountain of crap, basically underneath. I mean, not just the socks, but the actual emotions, to the point where you may get, like I did, where there's just so much there that it's, by the time you hit counseling, it's beyond the point of no return. Okay, so let's look at this another way. The circumstance is still the same. There are there are socks on the floor. So when I see that now, and my current partner is not terribly messy, but he doesn't clean up as fast as I do generally. So when I see socks on the floor, what I usually think now is, oh my goodness, he's like an absent-minded professor. He doesn't even notice the socks are there. I'm the one that likes a clean house, so I'll just pick him up and I take him to the hamper. And that's the thought is, oh, he's an absent-minded professor. How funny. Then what is the feeling that I have? What is the emotion that I experience with that thought? Amusement? Peace? It's just pretty neutral. And then what's the action I take? Well, when I go in the other room, instead of launching an attack or passive aggressive comments, I give him a hug or a kiss, or we have a nice conversation. And then what's the result? My relationship is much improved. So you see, it's really just a matter of knowing that your thoughts trigger an emotion. Your emotions generally will trigger your action, and then you get your result. And so the neat thing is you have a lot more control of what's happening than you think you do. It's not just like you fly into a rage from nothing. There has to be a thought, something that triggers it. And so you can look at that. So I want to, if you're thinking, well, that can't be right. I wanted to share with you one of my favorite sources, and this is where I learned about emotions and really them just being, it's just a chemical response in the body. It's a cascade of reactions that is allowed to flow through you ideally. And then you're left back at baseline. Your body goes back to stasis. It's just a vibration that moves through you. So if you haven't heard of her, her name is Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. She was a neuroscientist at Harvard. And in her late 30s, she had a stroke that basically took her left brain offline. And so the left brain is what is associated with your language center. So she had this really unique experience of not only being a neuroscientist, so as the stroke is happening, she's actually able to retain consciousness for a while and realize what's happening. But then after the stroke and its final effects hit, she was left without a language center for at least about 8 months, but in all total to get back to her version of healed, it was about 8 years. So during that time, while she was recovering, she was able to watch as her language center came back online, and she started incorporating thoughts and language back into her experience. So I'm going to share with you a quick quote here from her, which I think it's simple, but man, it is powerful. And then we'll talk a little bit more about, oh, that's the wrong one. We'll come back to that one. Yeah. Okay, here we go. There we go. Biologically, we are feeling creatures that think. I mean, let that land. We think because of, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. We think first and foremost, we're thinking creatures, but really we are feeling creatures first and foremost. And so I'll share a little bit more, about what she had to say. And I'm just going to read this to you because it's a little bit long for me to have put in a fun little graphic. So she writes, and this is again, Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. One of the greatest lessons I learned through the whole experience of losing her left brain for a time period. So one of the greatest lessons I learned was how to feel the physical component of emotion. Joy was a feeling in my body. Peace was a feeling in my body. I thought it was interesting that I could feel when a new emotion was triggered. I could feel new emotions flood through me and be triggered and then release me. Although there are certain limbic system emotional programs that can be triggered automatically, it takes less than 90 seconds for one of these programs to be triggered, surge through the body, and then be completely flushed out of the bloodstream. My anger response, for example, is a programmed response that can be set off automatically. Once triggered, the chemical released by my brain surges through my body and I have a physiological experience. Within 90 seconds from the initial trigger, the chemical component of my anger has completely dissipated from my blood and my automatic response is over. If, however, I remain angry after those 90 seconds have passed, then it is because I have chosen to let that circuit continue to run. Moment by moment, I make the choice to either hook into my neurocircuitry or move back into the present moment, allowing that reaction to melt away as fleeting physiology. And so that's the bottom line. Emotions are just fleeting physiology that you don't have to hook into. You don't have to keep thinking the same thoughts that keep triggering the same circuitry. So just like we worked on last week, you have the capacity to change those thoughts and to not hook into the circuitry. So I want to also point out what happens when you don't just allow that fleeting physiology to run its course. So stuffed emotions, and this is where this was the quote that was up a moment ago. This is our second and final quote for the day. Okay, this is from Scott Stabile, and this one's kind of amusing more than anything. Like, there's much more serious ramifications, but he writes that bottled up feelings burn and rarely come out tasting good. Think vomit-flavored sriracha. If you've ever had sriracha, it's already intense enough, but vomit-flavored, not good. So that's a very lighthearted way of talking about what happens when we suppress emotions. But the reality is, and the research shows, that when you suppress emotions, it can result in compulsions, neuroses, addictions, insomnia, psychosomatic illness, and even when you suppress emotions long enough, it can manifest as physical illness. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there's a wonderful book called Radical Remission, and it's by Dr. Kelly Turner, and she basically studied thousands upon thousands of cases of radical or spontaneous remissions from, let's say, cancer. I think she focused mainly on cancer, but I believe she's expanded her research now. Bottom line, these are, for some people, terminal stage illness, end-stage cancer, stage 4 pancreatic, brain, inoperable brain cancers, and everything, all the way back. And she studied around the world the people who had radical remissions. And of all of the many factors that she found that people incorporated into their healing journey, one of the ones that was a consistent one that came up every single time was they processed suppressed emotions. They brought emotions up and out that were in their body and stored from traumas, from relationships, from anything that happens just by being human. And so, yeah, suppressed emotions can contribute to causing disease. And on the flip side, processing them and bringing them up and out can heal. So what do you do to allow these emotions not to stuff and suppress them so that you can have that human fleeting physiological response? Number one, and this is going to seem so simplistic, but for some people, this kind of even basic vocabulary is not what you were taught growing up. It's not taught in school that I'm aware of, unless, a very progressive mindfulness-based education now, which I'm sure is out there, but I wasn't aware of it when I was in grade school. So number one, identify the emotion. And for some of my clients, they don't know how to do that. So I just say, do you feel mad, glad, sad, or scared? Because usually all emotions fall in some variation of that. So just identify, are you feeling more mad, glad, sad, or scared? Notice it, name it, then allow it. So if you are feeling grief, you may want to cry. You may want to journal. If you are feeling rage, anger, it's a very active emotion. You may need to do something like go and run as fast as you can, or go break some plates. I have clients that I recommend to go to Goodwill and buy a bunch of, 25-cent plates, put them in a suit or a pillowcase and break the heck out of them in your driveway. I've done that. So whatever you're feeling, or you may just want to sit with the emotion. Again, it is a chemical response in the body. And like Jill Bolte Taylor said, you can set your watch by it. Unimpeded by a thought, it's going to run through in 90 seconds. So just let the anger be there and then allow it to dissipate. And if you are suffering, but you can't, if you're feeling an emotion and you can't figure out where it's coming from, try to go back to the root thought and change it. So for example, I'll use an example that I heard recently, and it was from someone who went into methadone clinics to work with heroin addicts. And so she was talking to an addict who had been in and out of rehab. And she said, well, okay, so this last time when you went and bought drugs, what happened immediately before you went and bought the drugs? And the gentleman said, well, I was bored. And she goes, okay, well, going and buying heroin, that's pretty intense thing to be doing. Are you sure? Let's talk more about it. Like if you'd sat on the couch and you'd let yourself be bored, what would have really happened? He said, oh, I would have been crawling out of my skin with anxiety. And she was like, oh, well, okay. So you're feeling anxious. So let's talk about, if you let the anxiety be there, what were you thinking? And he was like, well, I was thinking that I've ruined my life. I haven't done with my life what I wanted to do with it. And so there was the trigger thought. That trigger thought that I've ruined my life, I haven't done what I was supposed to do, that triggered the anxiety. And of course, it was masking his boredom. But then the anxiety that he had was uncomfortable. And so then what's the action that he took? He went out and bought the drugs. So if you can go back and figure out the root cause thought that's triggering the emotion, you have more of an ability to change it. And so how do you know if you're avoiding emotions? And one of the biggest clues is look at your buffering behaviors. So buffering can be called a lot of different things. I like the term buffering, but numbing behaviors, distraction behaviors, avoidance behaviors, we'll call it buffering for our purposes. And basically, that's anything you do where you are keeping yourself from feeling what you are feeling. So, usual suspects: drinking, drugs, prescription or recreational, overeating, or using sugar and processed carbohydrates as foods, because those really tend to keep you from feeling the emotions. Gambling, shopping, or mindless scrolling through Facebook and social media, or binge watching Netflix. And that's not always going to be a behavior that's buffering, but if it comes with some type of a negative consequence, that's usually when you know it's a buffering behavior. So do you notice that you are buffering somewhere in your life? Like I have a problem with, I don't want to call it into being, but I have a history of emotional eating. So that when I don't want to feel something and I'm feeling stressed, my knee-jerk reaction is to want to go get some comfort food. So I know that when I go for the comfort food, there is some emotion I'm not wanting to feel. So if you sit down and allow yourself to feel the urge to go buffer, however it is that you do it, to go take that drink, to go open Facebook, just notice what is the thought that occurs immediately before you want to do that. And so finally, how do you use emotions for your benefit? Well, they really can be a guidance system for you. Abraham Hicks calls them your emotional guidance system. So use them kind of like you use Waze, that app that tells you what to avoid on the streets to get to your route the fastest, most efficient way. Use your emotions like that. If you are feeling anger on a regular basis, yes, you can definitely work on your thoughts around it. So there may be thought work that you can do to clean it up. But if you are constantly feeling anger and sadness in your marriage, for example, it could be an indication that this is a marriage that needs to be really dramatically transformed and changed, or it may not be in your highest and best interest to be there. If you are constantly feeling, let's say, for example, Carla McLaren is a social science pioneer, or empathy pioneer, social science researcher who she has a beautiful book called The Language of Emotions. And so she calls, for example, situational depression, not clinical depression, but situational depression, the ingenious stop sign of your soul, signaling that something in your life needs to be addressed. So it's kind of like, do you want to suppress the emotions? Do you want to buffer them? It would be the equivalent of if you had a nail in your foot. Do you just want to take a bunch of morphine and walk around with the nail in there? Yeah, you're not probably feeling it, but the root cause is still there. Or do you want to remove the nail? And so if you are feeling certain emotions on a very regular basis that are uncomfortable and you think they may be signaling something is amiss in your life, let's address that, not buffer it. Okay, so pitfalls I see. Number one, I see clients who just want to avoid their emotions entirely. And as we've talked about, suppressing them or ignoring them is usually not your best course of action. Or, at best they see them as a nuisance, or at worst they see them as the enemy. But using them as a guidance system. And that way you can be led in the direction of your best life, kind of like playing warm or colder, going toward joy and feelings of lightness and peace and happiness and expansion in your life. And then, of course, buffering. I see clients who just want to buffer, and that'll carry you for a while, but you look up, years, decades later, and the nail's still in your foot. So what can you do to change that? And then finally, what I see, and this happened in my own marriage, when you suppress for years, you just, do the passive aggressive route like I did, or we had a lot of overt conflict too. But by the time you hit a therapist or coach's office together, it's almost like there's, I always hold room for miracles, but in some cases, it's just like the resentments and the stuff has built up so much, it's almost beyond the point of no return. And I don't like to see that happen for people. So if you start working with your emotions as early as possible, you may be able to catch things at an early point, saving it, or at least you have full clarity and information that you maybe want to leave, but at least you are in touch with and using the emotions as signals and a guidance system, not suppressing them. So if you have questions, want to talk about your unique situation with this, I'm going to put my link to my scheduling calendar in the chat box, and you can hop on my calendar for a complimentary consult. Or if you just want to keep showing up for these webinars, I'll be doing them for the foreseeable future, at least till the end of the summer, I think. And if you want to, if you're listening to this, if you didn't get the scheduling link because you're not seeing this, go to my website, unhitchedbook.com. That's unhitchedbook.com, and you can grab a free copy of my book that talks all about this, as well as has my contact information so you can get in touch with me. And so I invite you to join me next week. I think we're going to be talking about what I call the cosmic rewrite. It's all about seeing things from a higher perspective. So join me then. Thank you so much for joining me today for Feeling All the Feels. Talk to you next week. Bye.